Hello, tomorrow, beautiful stage, and I'm really glad to be here. Thanks so much for the organizers.
Yes, it's great to be here. It's the first time I've been to Hello Tomorrow, and it's been a great day. Been to some fantastic events.
Great, shall we kick off?
Yeah.
And you have the most incredible background, and you won an Arthur C. Clarke Award for your novel, Dreams Before the Start of Time. Do you want to share a bit about your background, how you got into science fiction, and what books influenced you?
Thanks, Elsa. Yeah, my route into science fiction writing was very roundabout. You could say my career has been very fragmented, but it's just starting to make sense in recent years. I studied environmental sciences at the University of East Anglia, which did the very early research into climate change. And so climate change has always been in my mind since my teenage years. I then went into science journalism, writing for New Scientist, the Engineering Press, and The Guardian, and then completely switched and went into fine art. And after going through a fine art education, that's when I think I unlocked that creative little nut in my brain. And so, having studied fine art, it was a relatively small step to then start embarking on creative writing. And so that's basically when my science fiction writing began. How about you, Elsa? Because you're a scientist, so I expect you're a real scientist, so I expect your route was somewhat different to mine.
It was, but also kind of circular in that way. So I'm a synthetic biologist turned venture capitalist turned futurist. And to me, I've always loved, so I grew up as a geek, loving and just loving the stories of Jules Verne, where scientists were the heroes, and it was all about exploration and pushing the frontiers. But the book that really changed my life was called The Andromeda Strain, written by Michael Crichton, who then wrote Jurassic Park later on, which you certainly all know. And so it's a really terrifying story about a virus from space. And what it showed me was this tremendous power that lies within a really, really simple string of basically genetic software. And I just started wondering, could we hack this genetic software and manipulate this operating system of life to create a better and more sustainable world? And this thrust me into this rabbit hole of science fiction and also into synthetic biology. And so synthetic biologists are actually like software engineers of life, but also a little bit of astronauts, because it's really about manipulating genetic code to make useful things that make the world better and more sustainable, but also really about pushing the frontiers. And then later on, I had the huge privilege and honor to take part in a so-called satellite meeting at the NASA Ames Research Center, which was part of a conference. And I learned literally about space microbes, so astrobiology, synthetic biology, and it was just the craziest things to notice. Actually, we can use these microbes not just to make the planet more sustainable, but also potentially one day to enable long-term space exploration and make human settlements in space more sustainable as well.
Well, I suppose the influences on my science fiction were kind of slightly different in that I came into science fiction really interested in dystopias in a way, because I think the first influence on me was when I was still at primary school, when I watched Animal Farm, the animation. And at the time, I didn't understand what it was because it was a cartoon, but it was scary at the same time. And the other odd thing was that my parents were also watching it. So I kind of didn't understand at that age what satire was. I didn't understand the word dystopia. But because that was George Orwell, later on I came to his 1984 as a result of making that connection with Animal Farm. So for me it was 1984, Brave New World, and then, of course, Margaret Atwood with The Handmaid's Tale. So that was really my kind of introduction into the world of science fiction. Then kind of built on that with, of course, the movies. So Blade Runner was a huge influence. And when I watched Blade Runner, I was more interested in the fictional character of Rachel rather than Deckard, and I wanted to know her story. And eventually that led me to write my first novel, A Calculated Life, which has the main character is a kind of Rachel person, and it's her coming of age, virtual coming of age story. So really, for me, it was the dystopias, but I don't know how you feel, Elsa, about dystopias, if that's kind of off your radar.
I have to, so one part of me feels like, no, we don't need more dystopias because we already kind of live in a real-world dystopia. So if we look at what's happening in China with the social credit scoring system, I think I recently read an article that the system prevented something like an insane number, like 23 million people to travel, but at the same time, I think dystopias can actually be the first step towards progress, because literature and science fiction isn't just here to build fictional utopias, but also to spark the dialogue and spark diversity of thought and really foster these questions. What really is the world that we want to build or don't want to build? And the power of narrative is really tremendous. So dystopias are basically an empathy machine, and empathy is a means to the best design. So dystopias can help us explore societal implications of what we're actually building in the lab or in our startups, and really explore what's the world we're really building, and is it a world that works just for a small few, or is it a world we're creating that works for all of us?
Yeah, I feel a similar way about dystopias and also post-apocalyptic fiction, which seems almost perverse in a way to write post-apocalyptic because people are living in the apocalypse. As you say, you have utopia and dystopia alongside one another, even in one society. So I have a certain ambivalence now towards dystopias. And I prefer really to write now my science fiction in the very near future, to look at science and technology research now, and to kind of just make that small step to say, well, how could this play out in the next 40, 50 years, and then jump ahead another 50 years. You know, so really looking at plausible technology, although, you know, as a science fiction writer who isn't primarily a scientist, I'm often nervous about getting it wrong, basically. But you, Elsa, because you are a scientist, I'm just wondering, do you feel a greater obligation to the science to put the science in the foreground of your fiction?
Yeah, it's a good question, although I think climate science and environmental science is probably the most important kind of science there is right now. And yes and no. And so the thing that attracts me to reading science fiction is the same thing that attracts me to writing science fiction. It's really the fact that I think Einstein once said imagination is so much more important than knowledge, and exploration and exploring these worlds and creating these worlds and let others explore and share it with them is the most valuable thing to me. And we live in exponential times, so just innovation isn't enough anymore. We're not gonna save the world and save the human species and solve climate change if we just deliver 10% incremental innovation. What we need is really a tenfold disruption. And science fiction can really help foster this bold imagination. And also, to be honest, it's just self-indulgence a little bit, because I just love it so much. And I think Arthur C. Clarke once said, science fiction is the most powerful mind-expanding drug there is, or something like that. So I'm addicted to the future, and understanding science and science fiction kind of became the same thing for me.
There's one question I often ask of myself, and I'd like to also ask you, Elsa. I often wonder, when you are a scientist involved in research and development, if there's an invisible line that you detect, does a scientist feel that they would be actually damaging their career to speculate about where their research is taking them? Do you regard it as a no-go area to start talking to a general audience about the implications of your research? So what I'm saying is there the potential as a scientist to do damage to your own professional life by speculating about your work?
I think it is a very fair question, and I think the problem about the things that are getting really, really great about science are things like open science, democratizing science, and breaking it out from behind the walls of big institutions into the hands of everyone. And I think there's a problem if scientists or innovators in general just stick into their tiny, tiny bubbles, because what it does is it creates this Tower of Babel effect. So it erects walls of mutual misunderstanding, and it compartmentalizes segments of society into silos, and you cannot create innovation in a silo, right? And it creates echo chambers that can really easily then be weaponized. So I think society urgently needs science and technologies and startup entrepreneurs like you, but science also needs science fiction because it creates this gap. What about you, Anne? In your novel, you said it's set in the near future.
Yes.
And I think it plays on next generation fertility science, artificial wombs. How did the science spark the story, or did you build a narrative around it? How was your experience with that?
Yeah, thanks for that. So in my novel Dreams Before the Start of Time, it's really looking at the future of fertility science and the prospect of, say, in 40, 50 years' time, for the introduction and kind of more general use of artificial wombs, because so much research and development is now going into that area. So the story didn't come first, the science actually came first. I went to a book event at which a scientist, a geneticist, her name was Dr. Arati Prasad, and she'd written a non-fiction book called Like a Virgin, How Science is Redesigning the Rules of Sex. And this book was really about the current state of play in genetics and in progress towards artificial wombs. I found her talk fascinating, so I immediately bought her book and made contact with Arati. And I spent several weeks going through her book in line by line, underlining, and every few pages I would say, oh, I can really see a fictional story coming out of this. And then out of another page, I'd find another fictional story coming out of it. But in a way, I wasn't just looking in a positive or a negative way at it. I was thinking, what's in the near future for the next generation and the one after that? And I wasn't just looking at the likely consequences. I wanted to look at the fallout in ordinary, everyday relationships. I wanted to see how the introduction of artificial wombs, for example, what would be the unintended consequences? You see, that's what interests me. So as a fiction writer, I do what research scientists may not do, is that I stare out of the window an awful lot, just daydreaming. So I come across a line in Arati's book, and I'm like, oh, God, imagine two sisters. Imagine two sisters, just as this technology is coming in, and one sister decides to have an artificial womb for her pregnancy, and the other sister decides to actually carry her pregnancy. So how are those sisters going to relate to one another as a result of this? Are they going to view one another's parenting skills in that light? Has the woman who's carried a pregnancy, does she think her maternal instincts are better? Furthermore, will we have, this is what I'm thinking as I'm staring out the window, is that will we have different expectations of a child gestated in an artificial womb, using IVF, using the opportunity to do a bit of CRISPR editing, get rid of some of those unpleasant hereditary traits. And so you can end up with two children in the same family, one gestated in an artificial womb and one not. And just as we have different expectations, say, of one sibling who's been to a better school than another sibling, will this all get part of the mix? So it's not just about the science. And this is where the dystopia element comes in, because it's not just the science, it's the politics. And it's the personal politics that science is operating in that really interests me. So
I love that, and I suppose it's true. And in many big corporations today, they actually have, they may not call it this way, although some do, they have like moonshot divisions where they can prototype these kind of crazy ideas, and I think that's tremendously important. And also the protagonists in near future stories like Anne's, if you're the head of a company or you're creating a startup, in 5 years, these may be your actual real life customers.
There is one question. As I said at the beginning, I first studied at University of East Anglia, which had the climate research unit. So that's very much been at the foreground of my thoughts. And I have been involved in a grassroots carbon reduction project for 10 years. So I kind of like to get involved as well as writing about climate change. But I'm kind of wondering now, if it's not too mean a question, Elsa, to say that, you know, if you were to start your career again as a scientist, would you still choose biology? Or would you choose a science more connected with climate? Or are you looking actively for ways to use your scientific knowledge now to see how it could make an impact on climate change? Because obviously climate breakdown, climate catastrophe is the big subject, which is very difficult to address in literature. And I'm just wondering, you as a scientist, you know, do you have any regrets, or are you quite happy with having chosen biology?
I regret everything. No, luckily, you know, only most of it. No, not really. So, yes, I would 100% still do biology, and synthetic biology in particular, because I think mastering this operating system of life is really the magic power of humankind, and we can use it to help solve climate change and one day build a home among the stars. And so the most important, magnificent, powerful, ancient, complex, crazy design language that most people outside this room here have never heard of is called biomimicry. And I think this really bridges the gap. So biomimicry means looking at nature to take cues for design, because nature has perfected stuff like energy efficiency, heat transfer, energy conservation. And so unlocking the power in the blueprint of these designs that have evolved through billions of years, I think is going to be tremendously important. And I also, so tomorrow there's going to be a panel called Code of the Wild, where a couple of incredibly interesting people are going to attend, and one person, George Church, is actually one of the scientists trying to resurrect the woolly mammoth. And talking about climate and biology and you know, where should we focus our attention, I would stick to biology because, as I said, because there's actually a real climate cause to bring the woolly mammoth back and resurrect extinct species. So in the permafrost, this was once, this is a tremendously massive region that covers, I think, 24% of the entire northern hemisphere. And the problem is, as we know, it's thawing. So it was once the mammoth steppe, and now it's just called the tundra. And this soil is extremely carbon rich and holds about 1.5 trillion tons of CO2. And so the climate case for bringing the woolly mammoth back is recreating these species, these ancient herbivores, to keep the soil cool. So if they push away the snow with their hooves, the soil isn't as insulated anymore and therefore cools down. And this could really prevent to unlock this really, really dangerous reservoir of CO2 that's like a ticking time bomb, and release that back into the atmosphere. So I think biology really holds tremendous potential for us to solve climate change and co-create the future. And what do you think? Have you mentioned in the beginning you read Dystopias. Is there anything you think in terms of new genres, like perhaps ecofiction, that you know? So I've observed some new genres popping up, like ecofiction. Have you seen similar things or read something that really inspired you to think about climate change?
Well, there is a kind of subgenre now of cli-fi, climate fiction, and it's really interesting in a way that even some mainstream writers, mainstream literary writers, are being attracted to the field of science fiction, or what you might generally call speculative fiction. So you get an author like Barbara Kingsolver writing Flight Behavior, which is about the visitation of moths at the wrong time of year to the wrong place. And so I think it's interesting that, yes, there is a sense of urgency among science fiction writers, especially those writing about Earth-based science fiction, a sense of urgency about how to address climate change in our fiction. Because certainly in the literary mainstream, because the modernist novel is really focused on the everyday, about the minutiae of our lives, about characters going about their normal everyday lives, because it's very kind of inward-looking and very much to do with interior psychology, that it's very difficult to marry that kind of internal investigation with the big issues, with a big event, with a big event like an inundation, like a tsunami, like an event such as Katrina. So this is the challenge for science fiction writers. And my next book, I hope I'm kind of making some inroads with that. That'll be coming out next year. So hopefully that will follow the path of a climate refugee coming not from some far and distant place, but escaping wildfires in southern Europe. So I think definitely writers across the board are really challenged by how to deal with some of these very, very, very big issues.
Excellent. I can't wait to read it. We have about 6 minutes.
There's a poll just coming up here, and also some questions coming up. So can science fiction save the world? Apparently, more people than not think yes. So
it's switching forth and back. We're just waiting to see the stats again, but it was something like 80% of you think yes, science fiction can save the world, which is awesome.
I thought it might be the other way around. That's great. That's very encouraging.
These are very open-minded kind of scientists.
Yeah.
So.
And there's some questions coming up on Slido, so let's just see. People love dystopia fiction. How can we leverage this to make people act to prevent the real dystopia climate change presents? There is a school of thought that And I think it was covered recently in one of the in the press, in that sometimes, is it a danger that when we read fiction that makes us empathize and understand a situation, that that people feel that's enough, that they've empathized and understood, and does that in a way let them off the hook for actually doing anything? So I would say that in a way it's important to walk the talk. I think it is important for everybody, me included, to kind of look at within the sphere of our own influence. Look at our own lives and our own friends and see, what can we do in lifestyle changes. So yeah, I think science fiction is great to get us motivated and to give us that, lend that imaginative power that this is a possibility, without wanting to frighten people too much. To link up, to use the imaginative power of science fiction as a spur to see what we can do in our own individual lives and within our workplace, more particularly.
I agree with that. I think apart from us as individuals, I think the key to enacting change on a global scale will also be some of the biggest industry players, so the companies. And I think there was a workshop about speculative fiction or speculative design. And
design fiction.
Yeah, yes.
Design fiction.
Yeah. And I think new disciplines like this will be so important for us to embrace. And really, disruption is born at interfaces, and we need disruptive solutions.
Yes.
So nothing good can happen if the world's greatest minds are locked in a silo together, but the best things can happen if you bring together entrepreneurs and artists and scientists and just people, because people create the future together. So I think, yes, there's a lot we can do.
So there's another question on Slido here, unless somebody wants to put their hand up, please do. Saying SF is mostly showing us a dark future, and is there another path for SF? And I go back to my earlier point that, yeah, that we sometimes feel that we have phases where there's so many dystopias and post-apocalyptic novels. I mean, Cormac McCarthy's The Road is a fantastic book, but profoundly depressing.
Yes.
I don't know what you feel. Is there room for... I think there is room for a lot more positive. Personally, I don't really want to go to the dark areas because I like to treat the reader with respect. I don't want to spell it out to say this is a bad future, this is a good future, and I approve of, say, these developments in artificial rooms or genetic engineering. I want the reader... I present scenarios and interactions between human beings and leave it to you to say, how do you feel about this? This is the future, try it on, see how it fits. And then that's when politics comes in, obviously, because if you want to have some say in the direction we go in, then you have to get politically engaged, I think.
I think so too. And the positive, so cyberpunk is a genre, and then solarpunk is another genre. And I think sometimes writers or just genres and reader expectations are actually trapped in the genre tropes. So if you read a science fiction thriller, you expect a scenario about science gone wrong. And this is first so not just sex sells, but fear sells as well. And I think it can hamper our progress if we just focus on creating fear and this spiraling fear, because it's really powerful and it shuts off our reason and our reasonable thinking. And so I think, well, personally, I would love to read more let's say, cyberpunk, which by definition is high-tech, low-life. So it's supposed to be gritty, it's supposed to be dark, it's supposed to be kind of neo-noir. But I love about science fiction that it creates these worlds of grayscales. And I would love even the subgenres to push this a bit more open. So you can have a science thriller where something bad happens, but like actually in the Andromeda Strain, it's scientists that come to the rescue and actually save the world. And along the ride, drop some clues about how this might happen. So yes, I think science fiction doesn't have to be dark.
I think on that very positive note, is our time up?
I think our time is pretty much up. Yeah.
Thanks for coming along and for your questions on Slido. And keep reading. Happy reading.
Keep reading. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Elsa.
Thanks.